Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse once again. At the time of this recording, it is 11 a.m. Eastern Time on July 2nd, 2025. Happy birthday, America, for those of you listening this now. My name is Sebastian Parra, and I'm here with my co-host, Josiah McGee. And we are here. We are glad to see that in the last week, it seems like the ceasefire between Israel and Iran is holding, after weeks after 12 days of missiles flying into Israel, a lot of people having to hide. Thank God that the ceasefire is holding. This war has been called the 12-day war, and the world is already considering what might the new Middle East look like. There are rumors that the Abraham Accords might be expanding, and one of those prime candidates to join the Abraham Accords is Syria. As you guys know, the Abraham Accords were these peace treaties, these normalization treaties between Israel and countries like the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain. These are countries with whom Israel never went to war. So normalization is one thing, but making peace with former enemies is another. And that's why we want to talk about Syria today. So, Josiah, in order to make peace, one assumes you have to be enemies first. So let's go back to basics. Please give us a context of why Israel and Syria were enemies in the first place.
Yeah, that's an important question, I think. If you look at Syria, with or without this conversation about the Abraham Accords, over the last, let's call it 6 to 12 months, it seems like, similar to Israel, almost every week you have a year's worth of news coming out of Syria because of all of the really rapid changes that are happening after the end of the civil war. So there's a lot that we need to discuss, but it is important to start at the beginning and go back to the basics first, like you said. So why are Syria and Israel enemies in the first place? How did we get to this point? It all really goes back to 1948. So in 1948, Israel fought its War of Independence. It was trying to establish an independent, sovereign Jewish state in the Middle East, something that was very unpopular with most of the surrounding countries that also had different ideas about how the territory might be used or divvied up, and were especially opposed to the idea that there would be a sovereign Jewish state in the Middle East. Those countries include examples like Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and of course, Syria was very close to the borders of this new state that was trying to establish itself. So Syria was involved since the beginning as part of this anti-Israel coalition of Arab countries that were trying to destroy the new state before it could even be founded. And even after the founding of the state of Israel, were opposed to the idea that it should exist. The basis for the conflict between Syria and Israel since the beginning has been a lack of recognition of Israel's right to exist and be a part of the community of nations or of states in the Middle East. And without that, there has been a complete lack of any ability to form any sort of permanent peace. So you do have a series of armistices or ceasefire agreements that end wars between Syria and Israel, but they don't actually make up the basis of a permanent agreement. There's no permanent status agreement, permanent recognition of borders, permanent recognition of Israel's right to exist between these two countries. And that's been the issue all along, is that there's just this lack of willingness to take that step of acknowledging that Israel actually has the right to exist and be a sovereign state with borders that it shares with a country like Syria.
Yeah, well, thank you for that intro. To state the obvious, an armistice is not an official border agreement, settlement, peace. It's kind of let's stop fighting right here. So that's, I guess, what we are trying to move forward. So I understand why in 1948 Syria might have joined the other Arab armies to all right, let's destroy Israel. We can stop this Zionist entity from taking place at the beginning. But after Israel defeated them in the 1948 Independence War, tell us what happened next. What are some of the key features of Israel conflict with Syria in the next decades?
So they continued to fight a series of wars. They obviously didn't give up. Syria, just because it technically lost the 1948-49 war or Israeli war for independence, doesn't mean that they gave up on the idea that Israel could actually be destroyed. A lot of that was because there was a very close relationship with Egypt. Nasser, the leader of Egypt, who emerged after that war, really was a strong pro-Pan-Arabism or Arab nationalist. And he believed that it was up to this movement to accomplish what had not been accomplished in 1948 and 49, which was the eventual destruction of Israel. So as Syria became closer to Israel, they did eventually get sort of drawn into, Syria got closer to Egypt. They were drawn into these various wars that were being fought for Israel's eventual destruction. The 1967 war is a good example of this. The 1973 war is another good example of this. And what these wars basically were about was these attempts to destroy Israel. Now, in 1967, the Six-Day War, Israel preemptively attacked Syria and Egypt and was able to very quickly flip the script. It moniker 12-day war that's being used to describe what just happened in Iran is a reference to the incredibly fast speed and effectiveness of Israel's Six-Day War in 1967. And what happened essentially is that Israel took large swaths of territory. They completely flipped the script by preemptively attacking before Egypt and Syria could launch their own attacks. They took the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. They also took the Golan Heights from Syria. And this is an area which has been contested ever since. I'll put up a photo here, I think, because I think it's good to show people, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, one example of what we're talking about. The Golan Heights basically is a volcanic plateau / mountain range in northern Israel, southern Syria, that has been contested ever since 67. And the reason why Israel took this in 1967 is because Syria was able to use this high ground in order to shoot at Israeli farmers in the Galilee communities below, around the Sea of Galilee and the valley below. And they were able to use this as a tactical and strategic advantage against Israel to actually put a lot of pressure on these agricultural communities. Israel took it in 67 as a result of the fighting, and basically refused to give it back because it would represent returning that tactical or strategic advantage to Syria, or returning to Syria the ability to essentially terrorize these agricultural communities in the areas below the Golan Heights. Now, in 73, there were these massive battles fought because Syria briefly retook some of this territory in these large tank battles during the Yom Kippur War, which was almost devastating for Israel before they again flipped the script and returned the surprise attack and were able to drive the Syrians back almost as far as Damascus, eventually redrawing back to the Golan Heights area that they had taken in 1967. So those are some pretty key dates or milestones in the conflict between the two. I think the only other thing that I would mention is that there is, of course, this development of Syrian politics that is in large part response to this series of failed wars against Israel. That is important to note in terms of, okay, if the last major war was in 73, why has it taken 50 years for any sort of progress to be made since? And that's in large part because the Assad family came to power in Syria. And what you begin to see happening is, you do have examples where we'll put up another photo again, if you're watching this on YouTube, of a man that you're probably very familiar with, Bashar al-Assad. He's actually the second member of the Assad family to come to power. But this family marks essentially a shift, because prior to their coming to power in Syria, you have this very turbulent series of one coup after another kind of cycle of autocracy and oppression, instability in the Syrian government. When the Assad family comes to power, again, in large part in response to the failures of the previous regimes to defeat Israel and the embarrassment that the Syrian nation suffered in response to that, they create some stability. The problem is that it's not a good kind of stability. It's actually a very bad kind of stability. It's incredibly oppressive to Syrians. Of course, the Assad family is viewed as committing all kinds of crimes against their own people, crimes against humanity, stockpiling and use of chemical weapons. I mean, there's really all kinds of atrocities that we don't have time to get into, but just for sake of time, just to summarize it succinctly as we can, it was bad. There's a lot of bad things that they did to the Syrian people. But not just that, they also, I think, did a lot of things that were very detrimental to the relationship with Israel. And a lot of that is because they were, the Assad family, a minority in Syria. They come from an Alawite community, which is basically an offshoot of Shia Islam. It's not the majority of Syria. The majority of Syrians are actually Sunni. So you have this minority governing a majority population, which is always a recipe for disaster in the Middle East. And generally creates a dictatorship that requires you to form these awkward alliances in order to maintain your grip on power. In the Assad family's case, or in Syria's case, what that looked like was aligning with a number of different enemies of Israel in order to bolster their own political power, whether that be Palestinian terror organizations, be organizations like Hezbollah, which is a terror organization in Lebanon that also seeks Israel's destruction, or more recently, aligning with Iran and allowing it to use Syrian territory for a variety of means, especially during the civil war when the Assad regime needed even more allies. So all of this contributes basically to a Syria being a place where there is already hatred for Israel. You're importing even more hatred for Israel by aligning yourself with these different organizations and hosting them or cooperating with them. And you're creating an environment in which a regime that is not inherently strong has even more motivation to manufacture more hate or manipulate hatred towards Israel for its own political purposes, either as a distraction or as a means of creating some support that it could not otherwise. It's it's all just a big recipe for hate for Israel, essentially. But these are
Yeah.
important things I think you need to know about Syria's history and the relationship between Syria and Israel. Is it's a series of failed wars that embarrassed Syria, and Israel ultimately won. And it is a very broken internal political system up until very recently, at the end of the civil war, run by the Assad family, that created this permanent imbalance in the relationship between Israel and Syria, and created these obstacles to peace between the two.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Around Israel, around Israel's neighbors, using Israel as an excuse for rise to power is a powerful tool that has been used from Egypt to Syria to Lebanon, all over the Middle East, including Iran right now. So these dictators use Israel as a reason to ramp up militarily, and then when they go to war they lose, like they did in 48, in 67, 78. They continue to use Israel as a boogeyman to continue to oppress their people. That's why normalization with Israel is a great thing for the people of these countries, I think. For the peoples of their own country, who the government will have no reason to continue to oppress them for the sake of destroying Israel, because by normalizing relationship with Israel, the people will benefit. Both peoples will benefit. So, two quick little things as tips to our audience. One, thank you for putting out that picture, Josiah. That picture is from a place called Mount Bental,
Mm-hmm.
Bental. You have been there. I have been there. And thousands of our alumni have been there. So I would encourage people, if you want to dig a little deeper, and we'll put a map in a second as well, about, you can go Google Maps and you can Google Mount Bental, and you can see just how close Syria, this mountain, is to the Sea of Galilee, Israel's main source of water, and also to Syria. From there, it's about 30 kilometers, sorry, yeah, 30 miles, sorry, to Damascus, if you were to
Mm.
just drive straight, which of course you cannot. But when we go there, we can see the road to Damascus, where the Lord called Apostle Paul, and it's such a great place. It's beautiful. There's a we you can also see on Google Maps, people, if you want to. There's a little place called the Syrian headquarters right there. This used to be the Syrian headquarters in this area, which I think were built by the Soviets for the Syrians to fight against Israel. And when the Israel won the 6 Day War, the Syrians abandoned it. So today is this abandoned building where there's a lot of graffiti going on in this place. So we visit this area, and let us know in the comments if you've been there, because I know a lot of our people have been there. Hopefully we can go back soon. So thank you for setting that up. So we understand now that the reason why Israel and Syria have been enemies, because Syria has attacked Israel in 48, in the 6 Day War, in the Yom Kippur War. So now let's talk about the possibility of peace. Could you make peace with somebody like this, with a country, with a government like this? So you mentioned that the Syrian civil war was tragic, and I have some facts here for people. It was more than a decade of chaos, and about 600,000 people died. This We're talking about the government of Syria, the Shia minority, oppressing its own citizens and killing them, including chemical weapons. If you all remember, Obama talked about this red line of chemical weapons. Well, Bashar al-Assad crossed that red line, and really nothing happened. About 13 million people were displaced. There was really no chance of negotiations. After this, the end of the civil war transferred power to a Sunni group. So now when we're talking about the end of the war, we're talking about what happened last fall, last winter, when the Syrian regime collapsed in like a week, really. Josiah, I'll let you talk about that in detail, but let's talk about this new group. So again, you mentioned there was a small minority ruling the country, the Shia family, the al-Assad family. Now there is a Sunni group that is ruling the country again. So a Sunni majority leading the Sunni majority country. This group is called HTS Tell us about them, and can we trust them?
Yeah, so there's a lot of layers to what's going on in Syria right now. I'm going to try to, again, be as concise as possible in terms of outlining what's going on there, because it is a pretty dramatic change in Syrian politics over the last 6 months. As Sebastian referenced, there was an end of the civil war last December 2024. The Assad regime falls. Bashar al-Assad flees to Moscow with his family, and a new group essentially takes control of the country. What it was essentially is this rebel group that had been operating in other parts of the country, because over the course of the Syrian civil war, you had several different rebel factions, each of which had basically claimed different parts of Syrian territory. So the Assad regime, for the majority of the civil war, was not actually in charge of or had control over the entire country of Syria. It was basically a bunch of different areas that were governed by these different warlords or in some cases terror organizations, actually. And this was one of those groups, essentially, one of those factions that had control over a piece of Syrian territory. And they advanced very, very rapidly. Basically, the Assad regime collapsed, for lack of a better term. I mean, it really didn't put up much of a fight. Once this organization made its move, HTS is sort of the acronym for it, they were able to move very, very quickly to Damascus, and the regime just sort of fled before it. And again, there was almost no fight put up, essentially. It was just a collapse of the regime's military and security apparatus as people quit, more or less, on the Assad regime, and then the Assad family was forced to flee. Now, who
Yeah,
is this
they
organization,
left to
essentially?
Russia, right? They're in hiding in Russia. Well, they're just being
Right.
given refuge in Russia right now.
Yeah. Well, I think they're in the process of trying to get asylum there or something like that. So it's a complicated situation. But basically, what you need to know is that this organization didn't come out of nowhere. It's been operating for a while. It's not just been operating and fighting the regime for a while. It's actually been governing. It's had some practice at actually forming municipal governments and figuring out how to organize public services, how to create a system of law and order in the areas that it does control. And it basically felt like it had an opportunity, a window of opportunity that it then seized to actually take the fight to the regime in Damascus, and then take a stab at trying to set up a national government in a fashion similar to the kind of local government that they had already set up and been running for some time. Now, in terms of the nature of this organization, where does it come from? What is it, essentially? And then your question, can it be trusted? That's a loaded question. In essence, HTS is an organization that it's a rebel group, a conservative Islamist rebel group. It's also been known in the past, or has been designated in the past, as a foreign terror organization by the United States. That is because it is, or comes from, basically the Al-Nusra organization, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, or basically was Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria for a while. And it has these ties to that Salafist, Islamist terrorist part of the Middle East. And so it comes out of that type of organization or that environment. It is an interesting organization in the sense that it has undergone some evolution. It's not as extreme or conservative even as ISIS, and actually has fought against them. It comes from Al-Qaeda, but eventually split off from Al-Qaeda and tried to become independent, something that actually created a lot of conflict with Al-Qaeda, that felt like they were acting without the authority or permission to do so. They actually, in some cases, have been in violent conflict with Al-Qaeda over this issue of whether they should be allowed to go their separate ways or not. And you see, as they undergo this evolution of starting very close to and then eventually sort of leaving or becoming farther and farther away from, or putting some distance between themselves and Al-Qaeda, there's also this ideological morphosis that's happening. It's really quite interesting, where you start with this idea of, we're going to take Damascus and then Jerusalem, or we're going to be involved in this idea of pushing back against the West, and perhaps even serving the idea of a future caliphate, to more recently becoming much more focused and localized in their interests and their priorities. So now the rhetoric is much more focused on, and was prior to the fall of the regime, focused on removing the Assad regime, and then since the fall of the Assad regime, the end of the civil war, much more focused on building a national government, on creating a national government for Syria. And there's very little explicit mention since the fall of the Assad regime of any desire for territorial gains beyond that. If anything, they've basically denied those aspirations and said that they don't want to seize more territory. They don't want to take the fight to Jerusalem next. They just want to figure out how to rebuild Syria that was so devastated by the civil war. So really, really, really interesting phenomenon where you have this, again, this minority, fairly secular regime that's oppressing the Syrian people, and it's from this Shia background sect within Syria, flipping that script to a Sunni organization that is led by individuals from a variety of backgrounds that do have some connections to Syria, but also there's a lot of foreign terrorist fighters that have been imported or recruited to this organization who are now trying to figure out how to rebuild Syria and run a Syrian national government. It's like this really complicated, super interesting, but also kind of weird experiment. Can this even work? And there's a lot of questions about that. I think your question, can they be trusted, is the question that a lot of people are asking right now because they're positioning themselves as the answer or the solution to Syria's problems. We are the ones that finally managed to get rid of the Assad regime after over a decade of civil conflict, civil war. And we've proven that we can govern on a local level. Now we think we can do it on a national level. But there's a lot of people who are still skeptical. And I think some of the key questions that are being asked right now are, one, have they truly moderated? It's hard to tell. If you look at the results from the local governments that they built, you can make a case for and against the fact that they've moderated. Things have been okay in the places where they were governing on a local level prior to toppling the Assad regime. They haven't been perfect for minorities, but they've also been significantly better than alternatives like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So, you might consider the results a little bit mixed, but there's a question still, like, is that going to be true long-term, or is this just a performance or a show in order to get people to trust them? Fair question. I think, more time might be necessary in order to tell the answer to that question. Another question I think people are asking a lot of is, are minorities safe? Are the Alawites that the Assad family came from, are they actually safe now that the Assad regime is not in power? Are other Shia minorities safe? Are the Druze safe? Are the Kurds safe? Are Christians in Syria safe?
Yep.
And again, the results are kind of mixed because you have cases where HTS fighters, after coming into power and during the chaos of the early months after the civil war ended, when the transitional government is trying to sort of put the pieces back together and build some sort of national government and consolidate its security forces, a lot of chaos. A lot of bad things happened. There were massacres of Alawites. There were accusations that Christians were being harassed or even killed. And even today, you still have some of those accusations. What's really interesting is that you have this sort of internal conflict that's happening within HTS and within the new Syrian government, it seems like, because you have people like al-Shara out there saying, we have to investigate and prosecute these because we can't have this. We can't have, HTS fighters from Iraq, for example, killing Alawites in Syria. That can't happen. But at the same time, you do see that there are still people within the HTS organization that have a bone to pick. They have a vendetta, an agenda against the Shia Muslims of Syria that were oppressing the Sunnis for so long. And so there is this internal conflict still that I think is being worked out in terms of who's going to win out. The purists who have a vested interest in sectarian conflict, or the people who are just trying to get people to trust them long enough to build a national government before they tackle some of these bigger ideological questions about the future of Syria. Who knows? I mean, I think it's unclear yet who is actually going to win that internal conflict. And until that internal conflict is clearly resolved, there is an open question about what happens to Syria's minorities. Are they actually safe long term or not? And I think those are the types of questions that are going to need to be unpacked over time. But it's, again, early to tell because they've put together this group to build or write a new constitution for Syria, but I haven't actually finished that project yet. And that's the kind of project that usually takes years. So until you see a new document and you see a new consensus within Syria committed to a form of constitutional government, whether that be democracy, a republic of some kind, or whatever.
Just
Early to say, too soon to tell, I think
yeah,
is the general theme.
this is like a huge question mark, and I think one of the reasons why this is a huge gamble that the United States, Israel, with the brokering of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, is backing as well. It's a huge gamble because I don't think we ever seen anything like this, where a former radical terrorist turns statesman. Like all the great dictators of the world, shout out to all the great dictators of the world, they never reform, they never like go back to or go to democracy. So this guy, I just want to say, I am really hopeful but very concerned. This guy, thank you for putting up a picture of him. This is the leader
Yeah.
of the group that Josiah has been talking about, HTS. His name is Ahmed al-Shara. That's his real name, his birth name. But when he was a terrorist on the left, he went by the nom de guerre. The nickname of the terrorists carry was Al Golani or Al Jolani. And one fun fact, not so much fun, but his parents were born in the Golan Heights, this area that Josiah just showed in the other picture. His parents were born there and they were displaced by the Six Day War. So when Israel defeated Syria, Israel took control of that area and his parents were displaced. And this made such an impact of him that when he chose his warrior name, he chose to name himself after the Golan Heights, where his parents are from. So I think it tells you where he stands on this situation, or at least he stood 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Also, sorry, more exactly around 2010. One more thing is that I just want to clarify the name. HTS stands for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which means the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant. The Levant means from Syria all the way down to Egypt. So that tells you what were his intentions back then. So this is a guy. He has a lot of challenges. I think he has to keep control. One of the things that in Gaza we're seeing, for instance, is that Hamas has had a monopoly of violence, and that's why they stay in power. So in situations like this, the state needs to have a monopoly of violence, or the people in control. This happened to Israel as well. Like before Israel became a state, there were militias, there were like armed groups, and Ben Gurion, the prime minister, had to put it all together and demand that all the armed groups submit to the state's authority. So let's talk about those challenges. This guy has a big challenge
Yeah.
ahead of him. I guess let's root for him until it goes wrong. Tell us about some of these challenges and anything else you want to say about Al Golani, now Al Shara.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I think this internal conflict that I was just referencing is really challenging for Syria because you have a couple things happening. One, you have a bunch of different rebel factions that are now trying to be organized into a national military and a security force, and that's very challenging because they all belong to a different faction for a reason. So coming under one flag and serving one leader or central government is in and of itself going to be very challenging, especially when some of them were previously enemies. The Syrian civil war wasn't just about two sides, one side pro and one side anti-Assad family. It was the Assad regime and a bunch of other rebel factions all competing for control. And at sometimes shooting at each other, not just at the Assad regime. So trying to put all the pieces together and convince everyone to play nice is pretty challenging. And it, I think, has been a challenge. It's one of the reasons why you see these news reports coming out of Syria of sometimes there being some occasional chaos or lack of central control of these different factions that you're trying to organize into a military, or in some cases, massacres even happening that the central government does not condone, but also has a very hard time preventing because there is not enough centralized power in the central government yet to prevent some of these things from happening. That's a big thing that I think is going to be a challenge for them, is achieving an actual national unified government. You also have to figure out how they're going to prevent sectarian conflict. You have to figure out how to more effectively secure Syria's borders. Because over the course of the Syrian civil war, one of the things that happened was that you had very little territorial integrity. Okay? You basically had a bunch of different people from the Middle East or even other superpowers like the United States, Russia, who were using Syria as like a playground. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It was a playground for other countries because the Assad regime was so weak and it didn't have any real control over the country. It allowed other countries to intervene, and then that prompted even more countries to get involved in order to prevent bad actors from taking advantage of the situation. So by the end of the Civil War, I mean, you had at least a half dozen foreign actors involved in some form or fashion in the control of Syrian territory, and that's a problem because at the end of that process, Russia did pull back a little bit when the Assad regime fell. The United States is gradually transferring some responsibility to the new Syrian government, especially for prisoners who belong to ISIS. You also have other cases where people are not pulling back. Iran has pulled back some, yes. Hezbollah has not necessarily pulled back, even though the Syrian government has tried to expel them. There's skirmishes all the time on the border with Lebanon between Hezbollah fighters and the Syrian government as this new Syrian government tries to expel them and reinforce the idea that Syria actually has defensible borders that need to be respected. You also have Israel as part of this equation. Israel believes that the situation in Syria is so chaotic that it can't allow anything to unfold without Israel being involved in some form or fashion, especially when it comes to weapons that might be used against Israel in southern Syria or might fall into the wrong hands. You know, there are still a number of terror organizations operating in Syria that Israel has reason to be concerned about. And so, since the fall of the Assad regime, Israel's been active in southern Syria, actually, actively establishing a presence there, trying to ensure that it is able to dismantle different facilities or destroy weapons before they fall into the wrong hands. But that's a challenge for Syria. It's a challenge for the new Syrian government that it's trying to basically say everyone that is not the new Syrian government needs to get out so that we can establish control. But there are enough questions about whether the new Syrian government will survive or succeed that no one really wants to get out of Syria until there's more confidence that this is going to work, this experiment. And it is a challenge, I think, that they are facing and will continue to face until there's proof that they can actually get the job done. Just two more comments, and then I'll pitch it back to you, Sebastian, for some reactions. But I think there's two more things that are interesting to note, but also something we have to pay attention to because they could become a problem. And one of them is their ability to more formally integrate some of these minority communities, like the Druze and the Kurds, that have their own visions at times of autonomous, I would say sovereign, but like semi-autonomous control over their communities. And it's complicated whether they can formally integrate them or not into this new Syrian government. And the last thing is this idea of international legitimacy. It's not just that they want other countries to respect Syria's borders, but they also want other countries to respect the new Syrian government as a respectable member of the international community again, which it has not been for a very long time because of the Assad regime. They want sanctions lifted. They want investment to help them rebuild the country economically speaking. And it's very, very hard to imagine them rebuilding the country and succeeding in creating a new government if they are not able to get this economic relief. But at the same time, a lot of this economic relief is tied to this question of, are you a reliable partner, or are you going to betray these Western countries that put those sanctions on in the first place? From an ideological standpoint, are you going to eventually turn the fight back against some of these European or countries or the US or whatnot? So it has to really walk a very fine line diplomatically in terms of its ability to maintain the loyalty of the people that put HTS in power in the first place, but also conducting the necessary work of reaching out to and persuading the international community to accept this new Syrian government, that it's not going to turn into this terror state in the future. And it's a lot. It's a lot for any one organization or leader to try to be doing at the same time.
Yeah, it's a big gamble, like I said earlier. So he had a $10 million bounty on his head by the FBI. Trump removed that. And then Trump just removed sanctions on Syria. So it means that now, he wants to give them a chance. Now they can start doing business. Organizations can start working with them without being sanctioned for working with a terror supporting nation.
Yeah.
Here's where I come down on this guy. It's really concerning that this guy, literally, if you guys want to watch a frontline interview that he did, he says that the reason why he got into radical Islam jihadism is that he watched the Intifada in Israel. He watched the terrorist attacks on civilians, and he said that he was inspired by that. He wanted to join the fight. And then he said also that he was happy when 9/11 happened, when the Al-Qaeda terrorists bombed the United States Twin Towers, the World Trade Center. He said that he was happy, and he said that I wouldn't lie to you. Anybody in the Middle East, he says, that look at that and wasn't happy, they're lying to you. So this is him at that point. But now I believe, let's give, I think it's a safe bet because Israel has mechanisms, the United States, Saudi Arabia has a way to pull back and restrict him if things go wrong. But I think change is possible. I want to highlight that there's, for instance, the son of Hamas. This is the guy that you can guys look him up. He was the son of one of the founders of Hamas political wing, and he reformed. He is now a good supporter of Israel in the media. Another guy, I want to give a shout out to this brother. His name is Qasim Hafiz. He works for Christians United for Israel. This brother is a Pakistani British guy who was radicalized. He wanted to do some terror attacks apparently, but then he went to Israel and then he became a Zionist. He works now and he became a Christian too. So this brother, Qasim, we appreciate you and we're so grateful for your testimony. And then on a much, 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 much minor scale, myself, I was pretty radical. I was very anti-Semitic and I was very anti-Israel in college. And I was able to change my mind. So let's hope that this guy will change his mind. So Josiah, you tell us why Syria and Israel were enemies, the wars that they fought together, who is in charge of Syria now, who is this guy, what's his background. Now let's imagine together what peace might look like with Syria. Tell us what would be required of Israel, what is Israel going to give up, what is Syria asking in return. Paint the picture for what peace would mean.
Yeah. Well, before I do that, I'm just going to put one more map up because I think it'll be a good illustration. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, I think this will be helpful. If you're listening to this on Spotify, so sorry, but we'll try to just paint a picture that you can imagine what this looks like. So
I'm so excited to see the pictures in the podcast. So keep it going. Y'all let us know what you think.
Yeah, hopefully these are helpful if you are watching, and these are helpful illustrations. So if you look at this map, Sebastian, I think this is really going to be the central focus of any sort of negotiations between Syria and Israel in terms of what Syria asks for in response. This map is a little bit dated, I think, prior to the Assad regime, because what's happened now is that a lot of this territory in southern Syria to the right or to the east of that United Nations zone is now controlled by Israel. They have more of a presence in southern Syria as a result of the fall of the Assad regime and their military operation to demilitarize larger portions of southern Syria. Of course, the Golan Heights, everything basically in the Golan Heights to the left of this picture or to the west of the United Nations zone, Israel was already in control of. There's been some question about whether Syria was going to continue to demand all of the Golan Heights back from Israel or just a redeployment from or a removal of Israeli troops from the parts of southern Syria that Israel entered after the fall of the Assad regime. Little fun fact, interesting tidbit. There was briefly near the end of the Clinton administration, there was this very brief window where Bashar al-Assad's father was actually considering the idea of negotiating with Israel, and there was this idea of maybe peace with Israel and Syria could happen if Syria got the Golan Heights back. That fell through. Bashar al-Assad's father died shortly after, and then Bashar never really made the same effort or attempt to make peace that his father did. But that was kind of the dominant assumption for a very long time, was that Israel would have to give the Golan Heights back if Syria was going to recognize Israel. Now, there are some interesting reports coming out that maybe al-Shara is not going to draw that line in the sand, that maybe he would be willing to let Israel actually keep the part of the Golan Heights that they have held on to since 1967 and the Yom Kippur War. And what he would ask for is simply that Israel withdraw from the portions of southern Syria that they've controlled since the fall of the Assad regime, and that the border would be drawn somewhere closer to that United Nations observer zone. Really interesting idea. It's unclear exactly where things are going to land, but I think it's going to have to be part. I mean, you won't have any real permanent peace between Syria and Israel without them being able to reach some sort of progress on agreeing to borders and an understanding about what's going to happen to the Golan Heights. So that for sure has to be part of the equation. The other things I think are going to be very basic requirements for Israel as it comes to this agreement is, of course, a recognition of the new Syrian government and its right to govern the territory. Also, it's going to be important, I think, that they tackle not just the Golan Heights, but some of the water sources within the Golan Heights or southern Syria, because those have also been long-standing issues within the Israeli-Syrian conflict. Does Syria have the right to prevent water from reaching the Sea of Galilee? or not, or things of that nature. So those are some other examples. They may be a little bit more minor, perhaps, than this issue of the Golan Heights, but for sure, the Golan Heights is going to be front and center of any sort of negotiations between Israel and Syria.
Super important for Israel to have safety guarantees in this area. It's really high, and you can see down the Sea of Galilee, you can see down Tel Aviv. It could be really bad if Israel does control that area. So let's talk about the art of the deal. Let's finish up. This is the last section of the podcast, everybody. We just want to wind down and let you know exactly what's going to most likely going to take place in this exchange, in this agreement. So Josiah, tell us what Syria is going to get, what Israel is going to get, and what the United States gets in this exchange as well.
So yes, rapid fire. Try to go through this as quickly as possible. What do each of the parties get if President Trump manages to reach an expansion of the Abraham Accords that includes Syria? I think what Syria gets is proof of its credentials, that it's a serious new government that belongs in the community of nations, if you will, that it is committed to coexistence and being a responsible government or a member of the international community. It'd be big. It would be very, very big for Syria if they could prove this, because it opens up the doors to a lot of additional benefits like economic relief, economic opportunity, integration into the international economic system, which you're already seeing some examples of this, like them getting access to the international banking system again, a little bit of sanction relief from countries like the US, but there's so much more opportunity that could exist if Syria could demonstrate and prove that it belongs in the international community and it should be fully accepted. Making peace with Israel would definitely help Syria do that. I think Syria also would stand to gain a lot in terms of its border integrity. If it is accepted formally as a member of the international community, and if it can agree on formal borders with Israel, it would go a long ways, because virtually all of Syria's borders right now are contested by different actors, whether it be Iranian proxies or other groups, or in southern Syria, it's Israel. And it has to start somewhere in terms of drawing lines on a map that he can actually defend and are more permanent borders. So I think Syria would gain a lot in that respect. What Israel would gain from peace with Syria would be, I think, a few things. They would gain, certainly, the biggest thing would just be recognition of its right to exist. That was one of the big highlights of the Abraham Accords, was these Arab countries formally recognizing Israel's right to exist. Yeah. And it would be a really big deal.
We got Egypt already recognizing that, Jordan recognizing that. So now we could get the neighbors to the north, Syria, maybe Lebanon one day. So, but sorry, keep going. This is a big deal.
No, it's a really big deal. And by the way, Lebanon is also something that the Trump administration has mentioned. We think maybe we could make some progress here on adding Lebanon to the Abraham Accords too. So that's another interesting topic for another episode, but they're in the mix. I think it's just impossible to overstate how significant that would be for Israel, not just symbolically, but also strategically, to be able to say that they are able to, really put themselves in a position to be accepted and to have to worry a little bit less about whether or not their neighbors are seeking their ultimate destruction. Other benefits for Israel, I don't think there's a lot to be gained yet economically, because it's a slow process. Syria has been an enemy for so long of Israel that the process of suddenly opening up trade with Syria is going to take a very long time. I don't think it's going to happen nearly as quickly as it has with the UAE, for example. From a security standpoint, though, there probably are some benefits, and a lot of that is just very strategic. One, it helps you to build a stronger anti-Iran alliance. Two, it helps you to be invested in Syria and manage the growing competition with Turkey, which we have not mentioned a lot yet, but is, I think, going to become much more pronounced. The weaker Iran gets, the stronger Turkey is going to get. And it's important for Israel to have a role in what happens in Syria, because that is the buffer zone essentially between Israel and Turkey is Syria. So that's a big deal. And it also just gives them, again, more border integrity of their own. Syria wants strong borders, so does Israel, because it just makes everybody safer when you can agree on who belongs on what side of what line. So that's what Israel gains, I think, in this scenario. And last but not least, what the United States gets out of this, I think it gets a big win, a big foreign policy accomplishment for the Trump administration. It gets a lot more credibility for American leadership, I think. The more peace deals that you can reach, it basically offers proof of the American foreign policy right now, which has shifted a little bit from these long wars to a much more targeted focus on short wars that result in peace deals as quickly as possible. That is the basic essence right now of Trump's foreign policy in the Middle East. And if he can deliver some peace deals with countries like Syria and Lebanon, maybe the Saudis, I don't know, but that would really offer a lot in terms of proof that America's new foreign policy philosophy or doctrine that President Trump is trying to instill actually has some credibility. The international community can trust it and trust it to deliver results. So it's really interesting, I think, for us to watch and see if it works or not. And last but not least, I think we also have an interest in seeing this anti-Iran alliance strengthen.
Yeah.
And if this new Syrian government can make peace with Israel, then that says a lot about the lack of influence that Iran will have over the future of Syria and of the region as a whole. And I think that would be a net positive for the United States as well.
Yeah, let's remember that Iran had a foothold in Syria by supporting the Bashar al-Assad regime, and it was because Israel was able to defeat Hezbollah, which weakened Hezbollah in Lebanon, that the insurgency in Syria was able to defeat the Bashar al-Assad regime because they didn't have Hezbollah to come back them up. So I'm reminded of God's sovereignty here, that sometimes we wonder, why do evil things happen? Why do bad things happen? And the Bible tells us that God knows the beginning from the end. Sorry, the end from the beginning. He knows the end from the beginning, and that we shouldn't ask why do things happen, but what is the purpose that God has in these things. It seems, and I'm going into dangerous territory here, that at least one of the consequences of the October 7th war that we're seeing before our eyes right now is that Israel was able to turn its luck upside down. They were surrounded by enemies. They were in a really perilous state, and now they are able to defeat the threat in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran. They're much better right now, and this is some of the good things that have come out of this war. One last threat that I think we should be looking out for is Turkey. Turkey is obviously backing up this regime. They're very interested, and it so happens that the leader of Turkey is increasingly becoming more Islamist and more anti-Israel. Josiah mentioned at the beginning that regimes in the Middle East use Israel as a tool to increase their power. And Turkey has been saying some really concerning things about Israel to cement its power. So we're going to have to be looking out for that. And if you want to learn more about this, you should listen to a podcast by my superhero that I mention every week, Haviv Retivgur. You can look in his podcast called Ask Me Anything by Haviv. That's Haviv. And he did a whole podcast on Turkey with a Jew from Israel who was born in Turkey, and he's an expert in the Turkey relationship with Israel. Really great resource. So, all right, Josiah. I have one last thought as a Christian, from a Christian point of view here, friends. That's what we try to do as Christians. Well, first of all, if Israel normalizes relationships, Baruch Hashem, blessed be the Lord. That's great. I don't think we're going to see Israelis going down to vacation in Damascus, going down to Syria anytime soon, but at least this is a best case scenario. I think we need to be reminded that the Bible says, blessed are the peacemakers. So Israel making peace, normalized relationship with Syria would be a great thing. And I think we need to pray for this aspect of the President Trump's administration. He's really adamant about ending wars, ending conflicts, and especially expanding the Abraham Accords. We should pray that in the next 3 years and a half left of his administration, he'll be able to normalize, to bring peace with Israel and Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, maybe Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, and it's on the list as well. Second, let us be reminded that Syria is kind of the Christian homeland. It was a Christian homeland for 600 years. This is where Paul came and he was converted. He started a church there. About 2 weeks ago, there was a bombing in a church in Syria, in Damascus, in the capital. A group of Christians were getting together, and a terrorist came, blew himself up, killed like 20 people. These are our brothers. These are Christian people who were worshiping the Lord in the Lord's Day on Sunday, and they were bombed. So this is concerning. We need to be praying for our Christians brothers and sisters there, and just keep this situation in your prayers. One last tip: if you want to learn more about this, if you want to entertain yourself, there's a great series on Netflix called The Spy, and it's about an Israeli spy who went into Syria, and I'm not going to spoil it to you. It's amazing, and is played by the guy who played Borat, who is really funny, but in this role, he's very serious. So you'll learn some about this situation between Israel and Syria. Go watch The Spy on Netflix. Josiah, any last thoughts? Any last bits from you? Do you have any other pictures to show us before we go?
I'm sorry, I'm all out of pictures, Sebastian. No, but I do appreciate the recommendation, Sebastian, and thank you for having this conversation. I think it's just good for us to be aware and thoughtful of what's going on there, because it could be very consequential in the next few weeks.
Yes. Thank you so much, Josiah. Thank you guys for listening. Let us know if you have any questions in the comments. Let's pray for the peace of Jerusalem and the peace of the region as well. We'll see you next week for another episode of the Passages Pulse. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you liked this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.